All right, I think we can get started. It's just a minute over time, and so hopefully we've had enough time for people to assemble. We wanted to start today just by thanking our sponsors for making today's session possible, Chemonics and the Osprey Foundation. And next we'll introduce this lunch session today. So we are going to be talking about the Millennium Challenge Corporation's lessons from investing over $1 billion in pipes, policy, and people. So those various aspects of the WASH sector. And next slide, I'll very briefly introduce our presenters. So my name is Shrina Patel. I'm a Senior Director of Evaluation at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. I'll be followed by Mateusz Puchowski, a Vice President of Impact Evaluation at Social Impact. And finally, Dr. Claire Null, Principal Researcher at Mathematica. So Millennium Challenge Corporation, I'll go into it in a bit more detail next. We're a donor, and Social Impact and Mathematica are both research organizations who we work with frequently to conduct independent evaluations of our projects. Before we get started with the rest of our presentation, I wanted to flag that we have a poll. It's the first question in the poll about what type of organization you work with. We wanted to just get a sense of where our audience members are coming from so that we can sort of think about it ahead of the discussion portion of the presentation. And so onto the agenda. Our aim is to get through the full presentation in about 30 minutes to leave ample time for discussion. We'll first give an overview of MCC and our WASH programs, and then move into a more fulsome discussion about the results and the lessons that have come out of independent evaluations of MCC's WASH programs. And then, of course, we'll try to leave almost half the session for discussion. So please jot down your questions as we go along. On that note, we don't plan to stop for questions midway through the first half of the session through our presentations. But if you have clarification questions, issues that you really want to get a clearer picture of to understand what we're presenting, please put those into the chat. One of us will be monitoring the chat throughout, and we'll kind of stop the presenter if there's an important clarification question to get through. All right, so next slide, please, thanks. Okay, first I wanted to start with what is MCC? A lot of people are not always familiar with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and our name is kind of confusing for a US government agency, but we are indeed a US government foreign assistance agency, started in 2004 with the mission to reduce poverty through economic growth. So we are a sister agency to USAID, same kind of overarching goal of providing foreign assistance to developing countries, but we have different models. Through MCC, like USAID, we also provide grant funding to eligible partner countries, and we've worked with over 50 countries since the beginning of MCC. We, unlike probably USAID, we have a slightly different model. So we have an innovative and rigorous model that focuses on lower income and lower middle income countries only. So that is the first way we sort of narrow down the pool of countries that we work with. And then countries have to demonstrate commitments to good governance. All of our programs, the design and implementation, are owned by partner countries. So we work together on both of those. And we have a very explicit focus on results through our investments. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Another unique aspect of MCC is that we don't have any earmarked funding for particular sectors. Instead, we use a growth diagnostic tool to target our investments. So once we begin working with a partner country, we conduct this analysis of what are the binding constraints to economic growth in the country, and then we work together with a partner country to design interventions to really target that binding constraint. Finally, going back to our commitment to results, we sort of implement that with 3 different principles in mind. The first 2 are accountability and learning. We conduct independent evaluations of every project that we invest in to assess the effectiveness of that project and to help MCC learn and adapt our programming to have better impacts going forward. And second, transparency. We are big on transparency. We publish everything, all of our evaluation reports, whether they're good or bad, the survey instruments that we use, and the data sets that we create through these studies. And so I will close the presentation with a little bit more about where to go to find some of these resources that we have at MCC that we post publicly. You can also find in the Pathable site, in the files, there is a document there where we've included a lot of links to useful resources on the MCC website, where you can look into our WASH programs or any other sector programs. I realized I forgot to highlight another poll, which will be useful to me, but the question there is just out of curiosity, how many of you were familiar with MCC before I presented this slide? Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to just talk briefly about MCC's WASH portfolio. So based on our analytical process, as I referenced, MCC has invested across many sectors, and we've ultimately invested in WASH in 13 different countries over our 15-year period. And these investments have totaled to 1.4 billion. Another poll question, it's our third poll question. Just wanted to know if any of you have or are currently working in any of these countries, because we'll be happy to talk about your experiences when we get into the discussion portion. We have categorized our portfolio of WASH intervention investments into 4 different intervention types. So water, sanitation, and then drainage infrastructure. So 3 big chunks of infrastructure types that we invest in. And then 4th is hygiene training, which, because of the limited space, those are the words we use, but that's kind of a catch-all for some of the complementary investments we do in behavior change. We've also categorized the portfolio by rural and urban. So the light blue are rural-focused investments, and the dark blue are urban-focused. And at the bottom, you'll see a timeline of the different, where we've invested over time. And in our early days, our investments were actually not informed by a growth diagnostic. That was a tool that we introduced in 2009. So our very early WASH investments were largely proposed directly by the partner country because that was their area of focus. There was a lot of influence of the Millennium Development Goals at that point, which really led us to a lot of rural, non-networked water system investments, and with the aim to increase access to safe water. As I mentioned, in 2009, we introduced this growth diagnostic tool to help us target our investments. And so that meant that we did this analysis, and if WASH came up in that analysis as a binding constraint to economic growth in the country, then we invested in WASH. And so that was the case in at least 8 of our programs after 2009, so Jordan onwards in the timeline. And so with that shift in our analytical tools, we kind of moved away from rural infrastructure and more toward urban network systems that really called for large-scale infrastructure and water sector reform. Each of these projects has undergone an independent evaluation to assess program effectiveness, and that is what we'll cover in the bulk of this presentation. And Mateusz, if you can click one more, I've circled the 6 projects and evaluations that we will be referencing in today's presentation. Next slide, please. So MCC's focus on results means that we don't just monitor what we directly fund, meaning we don't just look at outputs and how many kilometers of pipes we built or how many, the increased capacity of water treatment plants, but we also go further to assess whether our investments have had the intended effect on households and businesses, who are our ultimate sort of population that we want to have an impact on, and particularly an economic impact on. And so when we design before we embark on any program, we lay out the theory of change or the program logic for each project and attempt to then develop a monitoring and evaluation system to track each stage of that logic so that we can ultimately determine whether the project's objective, that objective will sit at sort of the business and people level, whether that project was actually achieved. And so the diagram on this slide shows a simplified and kind of generic theory of change of a water supply intervention, where we lay out the types of activities we might invest in, so water infrastructure, sanitation or wastewater infrastructure, the sort of behavior change on the water user side, and then also water utility strengthening. And then we've sort of laid out 2 sets of results and outcomes that we might see coming out of those activities. So the first set at the water system level, are we actually getting more cleaner, more accessible water that is cheaper also? Is that actually happening as a result of the infrastructure and the sector reform? And then finally, water user outcomes. So are we seeing reductions in waterborne illness, time savings, cost savings, and then are those sort of resulting in increased productivity and increased incomes for the target population? And as I said actually not as I said. So in 2019, we had reached sort of a critical mass of completing a lot of our WASH programs and actually completing a lot of the independent evaluations, which take many years to finish after a program has finished implementation. And at that moment, MCC started a review of the results from 17 completed evaluation reports of our WASH programs. And we did this to really understand how we've performed at a sector level and identify lessons to improve our programming and improve our impact going forward. Overarchingly, we found that we did well on this first column at the output level. We managed to build a complex, large infrastructure and implement reforms in many of the countries we worked in, which is not a trivial matter, as I'm sure everybody in the room can recognize. However, we kind of had mixed results at the next level, the water system outcome level. Sometimes, yes, the infrastructure did immediately translate into more water in the system, but then there may have been other issues that we didn't address appropriately related to non-revenue water, which meant that we didn't see the system sort of functioning in the way that we had anticipated. And we have definitely struggled to detect impact at the water user outcome level. And so, we'll talk a little bit more about our MCC's reflection on these findings toward the end of the presentation, but we've just definitely recognized how complex these systems are and how challenging it really is to reduce waterborne illness as a start, let alone all of the economic impacts that we want to follow from that. And so while this graphic makes the theory of change look kind of simple, again, I think everyone in the room knows how complex and sort of intermixed across many different dimensions these systems are, and the evaluations have really highlighted that aspect. So I will now turn it over to Mateusz to discuss some of the evaluations that really highlight this complexity, and in particular, he's going to be talking about 3 of our infrastructure-heavy WASH investments in Tanzania, Lesotho, and Jordan.
Thank you very much, Shrina. Can I just get a thumbs up, Shrina, that you can hear me before I begin? Excellent. All right. Thank you, Shrina, and thank you, everybody, for joining us from all over the world. We really appreciate your time. I want to start out by talking about systems thinking in the design of urban water investments, and then shift to a presentation of key findings from these 3 evaluations that Shrina alluded to. So we know that urban water networks are complex systems, and they are comprised of interrelations between the physical infrastructure, the utility that is managing that infrastructure, and the consumers that are benefiting from the infrastructure. So any kind of investment into this complex system is invariably going to affect other parts of the network. Now, sometimes these interrelations are very straightforward and linear, such as this simplified graphic, where increased throughput into the water network leads to increased supply of water within the household. But even seemingly simple things like this can become complicated. They may hide and display unexpected or counterintuitive behaviors, such as the conveyance of increased volumes of water within the network could also lead to increased non-revenue water through increase in leakage. So ultimately, donors are not interested in improving the infrastructure for infrastructure's sake. Ultimately, what they care about are improvements in economic or social objectives. And one way of formulating that is to come up with a program logic, like this theory of change displayed here on the screen from the Tanzania Compact. At the left side of the screen, we have the activities that MCC was funding. And as we travel to the right side of the graphic, we are projecting higher and higher level outcomes that were theorized to manifest as a result of these investments. Now, as Shrina said, MCC has learned a lot over the course of funding these types of projects. And one of the lessons is that if you abstract a complex system, such as an urban water network, into a series of linear relationships, that is not going to necessarily be reflective of the complex realities that we encounter in the real world. So moving from the Tanzania Compact to the Jordan Compact, this was a much more complex theory of change that used systems thinking in the design of 3 interrelated investments. So what we have here on the left side of the graphic is the fresh water that is delivered both to urban consumers in Zarqa, that blue circle at the bottom, as well as farmers in the Jordan Valley for agricultural purposes, the red circle at the top. A subset of the urban water that is consumed was captured through the existing wastewater network, conveyed to the wastewater treatment plant, and ultimately blended with the Jordan River and used by those Jordanian farmers, right? So this is what the system looked like at the beginning of the project. Now, as mentioned, there were 3 components of this intervention. The first one was to upgrade the wastewater treatment plant to allow it to process, to treat a larger quantity of water. The second intervention was upgrading the freshwater system through the rehabilitation and the replacement of pipes, but also pumping stations and other types of infrastructure. Now, the theory goes that if you upgrade the supply side of the equation, you would have reduced water losses. See that arrow getting larger. This will become a theme. Those reduced water losses would be used by urban consumers, both household and businesses, and a larger volume of wastewater would then be captured, conveyed to the treatment plant, which now has higher capacity to treat that water, and it would result in more water recycling that could be used by those farmers downstream. The third part of this intervention was upgrading of the sewerage network, primarily rehabilitation and replacement of sewer pipes. Okay, what would this do? It would allow a larger quantity of the consumed water to be captured, conveyed once again to that treatment plant, once again increasing the flow of water to those farmers. And we're not going to stop here. What ultimately MCC cared about is the substitution of that high value fresh water sources away from agricultural purposes. We see the arrow getting smaller, and we are reallocating that fresh water supply to the urban areas for higher value economic purposes. So what we have done is we have increased the net volume of water and rebalanced it for more optimal economic purposes. Now, obviously, this is an oversimplified schematic. In real life, what we were grappling with is something that looked a little bit more like this. This spaghetti diagram, it has certain commonalities with the previous theory of change that I showed you from Tanzania. It still moves from left to right. It still has a series of columns that have ever increasing types of outcomes. But the key difference here is that there are bidirectional relationships. You'll see that some of the arrows point in both directions. You'll also see that it's not a one-to-one linearity. Many of the nodes in the system are connected to one another, showing a much more realistic and representative picture of what is going on or what was hypothesized to be going on with this project. So the takeaways from this introductory portion are really that we must apply a systems lens to the design of urban water investments, and that is necessary for 2 related reasons. Number 1, if we think from a systems perspective, we are more likely to understand the broader range of possible effects or outcomes that could manifest from these investments. And secondly, if we think through how the different parts of the network are connected with one another, we are going to promote the likelihood of achieving those higher level objectives as well. So I want to move now the conversation from a discussions of systems thinking into a relatively shallow, because of time constraints, discussion of the 3 social impact evaluations and some key findings of broader salience, hopefully, for the group. So first, I want to start with a quick overview of methods, just to convey to you a sense of the scale and the rigor of these studies, so you know how much confidence to have in the findings that I will present afterwards. So in the graphic displayed here, we have a schematic that shows the geographic location and the frequency of key data collection events in the MCC Jordan water evaluation. Now, Critically, remember that circular schematic. There was so much going on in the network. So many different beneficiaries and parts of the system were being affected that it was impossible to design a single evaluation that would capture all of that information and to answer MCC's questions of whether or not those expected outcomes would materialize or not. So similarly to the systems thinking and the design of the investments, our team thought through a systems lens in the design of the evaluation. What we ended up having through the leadership of Dr. Mark Juland, who was the principal investigator at Duke, was a series of nested impact and performance evaluations. Among the farmers, we used a natural experiment that exploited baseline differences in the relative access to blended wastewater. In the urban areas, we use propensity score matching to identify comparison households and comparison enterprises for those beneficiaries that would receive the MCC support, either through freshwater improvements, wastewater improvements, and importantly, the combination of the two. So we had a factorial design. We also were expecting the utility to rebalance the water network once the investments had been made, to have more optimal and equitable distribution of the water within the network. If we did not take this into account, we would have had these kind of inter-system spillovers. So to account for this, we also identified comparisons within Amman served by a different utility to measure the amount of this spillover. Finally, we had a series of cross-sectional surveys to look at confounders, such as the large influx of Syrian refugees that happened during this study period. We worked with the water utility to look at performance indicators and compare them to other utilities in the region. We did water balance modeling to try to ascertain the exact quantity of water that was increase in quantity of water that was attributable to this project, and even projected it out. A large number of complex methods. All in all, more than 18,000 surveys were administered over this 5-year period. So this was a large undertaking. So hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of the scale and the rigor of MCC's evaluation investments. So going back to Shrina's point about the emergence of the output level results, we can confirm that across the portfolio of the 3 social impact studies. In Jordan, hundreds of kilometers of sewer pipes and water pipes were replaced. This led to a fairly large increase in the use of blended water by the farmers. And ultimately, remember the terminal node in that systems diagram was that more water would be made available for urban purposes. And we confirmed that to the tune of 5 million cubic meters per year increase, an amount that was expected to increase to up to 8 million cubic meters per year. So from the base theory of change, the evaluation validated MCC's logic at the output level, at least. Although some of that is lower level outcomes. Similarly, in Tanzania and Lesotho, I won't go as much in depth on those. We confirmed the emergence of these lower level outcomes. However, when we look higher up the theory of change, that causal logic that goes from better pipes leading to social and economic benefits, we do not see as strong evidence of success. What we have here is a simplified theory of change from the Tanzania Compact. We see on the left side of the graphic a lot of green check marks showing that the achievement of those outcomes was substantiated by the evaluation. However, as we move towards the objectives and the goal, we see that there are inconclusive results. We were not able to validate the achievement of those results. If we look at this theory of change from Jordan and overlay a similar line of inquiry, we see that on the left side of the equation, those outputs and outcomes that are more closely within MCC's manageable interest were achieved. But as we shift to the right of that diagram, those higher level results, many of them did not manifest. So what could explain this discrepancy between the achievement of lower level and the lack of achievement of many higher level results? Well, it could be driven by exogenous factors. And as we saw with the Syrian refugee movements, population growth in Dar es Salaam, various climate change, surely these things did happen and they do contribute. There could be flaws or limitations in the evaluation designs. And to an extent, this is true. The measurement of diarrheal rates, for example, across many studies is statistically underpowered given their low prevalence. But A large degree of the non-achievement, I think, should be explored through the project theory of change, or what was theorized to emerge as a result of the investments. So I'll highlight a couple of interesting key findings from these studies as they first relate to consumer behaviors and then utility performance. So in Jordan, remember that the ultimate objective of water substitution was achieved. But there was a second key objective called the secondary substitution effect, where MCC theorized that by increasing the quantity of available water to household consumers, they would shift their consumption behavior away from expensive private water sources and towards the lower cost, but still high quality network water. This would result in cost savings, which would have all kinds of reverberating economic impacts. However, the evaluation did not substantiate any increase in household cost savings. Now, the explanation is fairly complicated, but a large degree of this rests in consumer behavior, specifically in the lack of trust that residents in Zarqa had of utility water. Now, even though the evaluation had water quality testing, and even though we were able to substantiate that the water from the network was clean, met all of the necessary benchmarks, consumers do not believe it. There is a pervasive sense of mistrust that, interestingly, is even held by fairly senior people within the government. So it's not a large kind of misconception amongst a certain subset. It is a pervasive issue. And because of this lack of trust, they did not substitute the behavior as much as MCC theorized. In Tanzania, the opposite happened, fascinatingly. The theory of change posited that having more water of high quality within the network would lead to increased consumption of network water and a reduction in waterborne diseases, specifically diarrheal illness. The study did not find any impact, and while there were certainly power considerations, I think a large part of this also is explained by consumer behavior, because as residents of Dar es Salaam shifted their consumption practices from a complex portfolio of different types of sources, network, rainwater, surface water, for different types of activities, as they shifted that towards piped water, their high degree of trust in the utility water made them think that they do not need to treat the water as much in their storage containers. So the quality of the water did not change over time, even in the storage containers, even though it really should have. The difference being the lack of treatment. So the takeaway here is that if we want to ultimately have impacts on consumer behavior, we really have to understand consumer behavior and document it ex ante. And understanding how customers interact with the system, with the water, might necessitate revisions to the theory of change, or at least supplemental activities like behavior change communication about treatment of water, or trying to convince people as to the water's safety. Okay, now moving from consumers to the utility. Across all three of these evaluations, we did not find any impact of utility reductions in utility operating costs. In fact, in some, we found a negative impact. The reasons for this vary across all three studies, and I'll briefly highlight them. Jordan. So the idea here is that before the MCC investment, the utility was using a lot of pumping in a periodic high pressure distribution network. The MCC investment was at least partially designed to have more gravity-fed distribution through district metering areas, DMAs. The idea with these kind of sealed-off sub-systems was that the utility would be able to provide better service and to reduce wear on the infrastructure. However, the authorization of DMAs is complicated, and in our evaluation, we found that some of these DMAs were not fully isolated. Some of the bulk meters that were at the intake of the DMA were not operational, that there was insufficient knowledge and capacity of utility managers to operate these DMAs. And all of this in combination led to a suboptimal operation of that investment. So that's on the network side. On the customer side, customers received new meters. And because of meter error at baseline, oftentimes under-registering consumption, when the customers got new meters, their water bill increased without any corresponding increase in consumption. So the price per unit of water actually increased. Additionally, customers were used to the high pressure of the previous network and sometimes registered kind of disgruntlement with the new system. So customer pressure plus these network effects led to a kind of, at least in some DMAs, a retrenchment away from the model and an increase in operating costs. In Tanzania, there was unreliable power provided to the utility. And this unreliability in the power supply led to many shutdowns. And each time this happened, it damaged machinery, and there was insufficient both capacity as well as resources to deal with that damage. Furthermore, the increased volume of the water conveyed through the network was not supported through a corresponding increase in the human or the organizational resources of the utility. So they had to manage a much larger quantity of water, more customers with the same resource base, creating all kinds of issues. And then finally in Lesotho, it was different investments, infrastructure investments, some of which had unsuitable designs. So even though they were built accurately to specification, the specific investments were misaligned with the needs of those specific communities, once again leading to suboptimal utility outcomes. Putting all of this together, what are the takeaways? Number one, if we are making these complex interventions in urban water systems, we really have to consider the broader implication, both positive and negative. Secondly, we see how important consumers and utilities are in the operation and downstream impacts of these investments, and it is absolutely imperative that we interact, engage with them early in the design process to understand these behavioral responses, to understand incentive structures. And this will require time, additional time for data collection, for program design, as well as additional data collection. So it will cost money and it will require time, but it is necessary. Second or third, the designs that we might have developed before these consultations might have to be redesigned in response to these technical challenges or these behavioral realities. And then finally, as we make these investments and monitor their performance, it is absolutely critical that we follow up with these key stakeholders and try to ascertain what is going on with these end beneficiaries. So that is all for my session. I'll now turn it over to Claire. Claire, you are muted.
Thank you. No, okay, now, sorry. Thanks for the reminder of that, and to Mateusz and Shrina for setting us up so well for this one. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'll try to be pretty brief, but I'm going to tell you about another evaluation that we conducted for MCC here, focusing more on institutional reforms. So there is an infrastructure component, but Cabo Verde was MCC's in the WASH sector, their first case of really putting most of the emphasis on institutional and regulatory reforms as opposed to leading with infrastructure. So Mateusz, advance one. The ultimate goal here was to serve customers, of course, but the MCC recognized that to do that, it would have to work through improvements on the utilities side. Advance, Mateusz. And to get them, and that would all have to happen within the context of institutions that govern how the utilities operate. And advance again, Mateusz. And they used, in this case, infrastructure as a carrot to try to incentivize the utility to change. Next slide. So just to tell you a bit about the situation in Cabo Verde before the compact happened, and I think this is pretty typical in many settings, actually, that they were stuck in basically a vicious cycle in which the utilities had low revenues. And in fact, these weren't even utilities, these were mostly municipal water departments of the government. With those low revenues, there was only low investment in expanding the network to serve more customers and improving quality of service. And because service quality was pretty poor, not many people felt so compelled to pay their bills even. And the whole thing also wasn't really set up with incentives for economic sustainability. The government was constantly injecting money to subsidize the municipal water departments. So to break out of this, MCC's idea was to use infrastructure as the incentive. Next slide, Mateus. So the compact offered infrastructure grants specifically to municipal water departments or utilities that were making progress towards becoming corporatized. Next, advance. So these municipalities, as they corporatized, they would take on different behaviors. So they would have more rational levels of staffing. They would operate on sort of business principles as opposed to being so motivated by politics. Next, advance, Mateus. But they would still, thanks to new regulations, have social inclusion objectives. So they would still need to serve, the population as sort of preserving some of the political incentives there. Next slide. So as they made progress to becoming corporatized, they would be able to access the grant funding that would allow them to expand their service area and or improve service quality. That in turn, next slide, would help them acquire more customers and convince the customers they had to pay their bills more reliably. That would generate more revenue for the utility, which finally would feed back into further improvements in the service quality or in the service area. And again, all of this happened in the context of additional reforms at the national level in terms of creating a technical regulator and developing strategic plans to help the government think about where investments were most needed. I should have noted that Cabo Verde is a unique country. It's basically volcanic islands. There are very limited freshwater supplies there. So although it's one of the very few countries that relies largely on desalinated water, which of course is very expensive. So thinking about how to prioritize investments is crucial, particularly in Cabo Verde. The second component of the institutional reforms was to change the tariff setting processes and try to make them more progressive or at least less regressive, and to regulate service quality. And finally, there were new standards for water quality and environmental oversight. Next slide. So just, oops, there's a funny animation here. Can you advance again, Mateus? And again. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Just to tell you a little bit about the design of this evaluation, we've had 2 rounds. It's a performance evaluation using mixed methods. Our interim round of the evaluation was conducted in 2017, 2018, shortly after the project ended, basically. And we're just gearing up to do our end line evaluation, which will be about 4 years after the compact ended by the time we do it. In both rounds, we have a qualitative process evaluation component with key stakeholders and with customers. And we also have made use of survey data. So there was a baseline conducted before the compact began. We were able to use those secondary data for pre-post comparisons. We also collected primary household data from households at large on the island of Santiago, and also those who benefited from subsidized connections through part of the project activities. And we had an excellent working relationship with the local utility that was established as the largest one that was established as part of the compact in reaction to the incentives for infrastructure funding. And they shared with us billing data and payment data, which we were then able to link with our survey data to answer additional questions about their customers. Next slide. So just to walk you through some of the key outcomes, starting first with the sort of water system questions. First of all, we confirmed that indeed the new corporatized utility was created and operating on commercial principles. And this was no small feat. It required national legislation to make it happen. It took the governments of 9 municipalities to agree to give up their municipal water departments, sort of trade in that political capital and become shareholders of the new corporatized utility. So it was quite a lengthy process. It took almost the entire 5 years of the compact, which left the new utility with relatively little time to sort of get on its feet. But thanks in part to ongoing support that was provided by LuxDev as the compact was coming to an end, and in the first years after the compact, the new utility has really solidified and is now providing service. Well, from the very beginning, they were providing service across the island, took over all of the municipal water department's staff and started maintaining billing, et cetera. So that is a big success. Next. The works were completed, but there was no reduction in technical losses. So this was because the way there wasn't really enough of an incentive to think about service quality in the offering of the infrastructure grants. And since it was municipal water departments selecting what projects they wanted to propose before this new sort of harmonized national priority setting process was really in place, many of these municipalities chose network expansions rather than service quality investments because it was more politically expedient to them. So that was kind of mixed progress there, as indicated by the yellow pie. And finally, Mateusz? The new utility acquired more customers, but it was too soon to know by the time of our interim evaluation whether that would actually improve the utility's financial position. And this was for a few reasons. First of all, the increasing block tariff that's used, this utility has gotten approved, subsidizes the first 5 cubic meters for all customers. At the time that the compact was happening and the new utility was being set up, the country didn't have any way of identifying high need or low income households. And so they had to, in order to make sure that everyone had access to a sufficient quantity of water, they had to offer it literally to everyone. So even as they get new customers, the first water that they're providing to them is actually a burden on the utility. There was also, at the time of our interim evaluation, not yet any reduction in commercial losses or improvements in the collection ratio. And there were more customers, but no more water to provide for them. There had been an expectation that another donor was funding an additional desalination facility, which was going to increase the supply for the utility, but that was happening separately from the compact. And so when that fell through, then these investments that had been initiated by the municipal water departments and then taken over by the new utility, they're left with additional network, but no extra water to put through it. Next slide, Mateusz. So now thinking about sort of a simplified theory of change and the effects that were expected on consumers, we have 2 activities to think about. First of all, the corporatized utilities were expanding their service area and to some degree trying to improve quality of service. And then there were the regulatory reforms, which aimed to do a better job balancing utilities' financial sustainability with a service mandate. So what was expected was that, first of all, expenditures on water and sanitation would be more equitably distributed across socioeconomic groups. Secondly, poor households would spend less time collecting water, and they would have more water to use. And ultimately, this was expected to lead to the same outcomes that Mateusz was mentioning in terms of household productivity due to time and cost savings, health benefits, and new business opportunities. But what we found was similar to the patterns Mateusz mentioned, better progress on sort of the initial steps in the theory of change. So expenditures on water and sanitation services were more equitably distributed across SES groups. That was largely due to the harmonization of prices at public fountains with the price of water through the piped network, which previously, ironically, households who were collecting water sort of 1 jerry can at a time were paying more per liter than households who were supplied by the piped network. So the harmonization reduce the prices at the public fountains, but the tariff remains regressive. As I mentioned, by pooling the household survey data with the billing and payment data, we were able to confirm that the majority of water provided by the utility to its entire customer base, the majority of the subsidized water goes to non-poor households. And this is exacerbated by the fact that many poor households share connections with one another. So when a poor household shares with another poor household, they use more water and they don't get double the subsidized amount. They just get the subsidized amount for one household. More households did get connected to the pipe network, which was good news, but we didn't see, go ahead, Mateusz, we didn't see the household outcomes that were expected in terms of time use and expenditures. This was partially because the theory of change that MCC was working with was not fully validated at the beginning. There was an expectation that households were spending lots of time collecting water, but from the baseline survey and also from our follow-up data, it turned out that households who didn't have piped water didn't actually spend that much time collecting water. And because there wasn't additional supply, even those who got connected to the piped network, still almost half of them spent time collecting water on a regular basis. Next slide. So just a few common themes we've seen in other evaluations, expanding beyond water and thinking about sort of institutional reforms that relate to sanitation. I'll profile the Lusaka water supply, sanitation and drainage project in Zambia. Here, there was an interesting piece of the theory of change, or sort of disconnect between the theory of change, which was that there was an expansion of the sewer network plan for one low-income community. And although in the theory of change, the expectation was that this would improve health in that particular community, in talking with the stakeholders who were designing the compact and working on implementing this, in fact, the necessity for that sewer network was motivated by improving water quality for the entire city, because that community is sitting, their shallow, the shallow aquifer is potentially contaminated by the pit latrines in that particular community. So this was a case of sort of disconnect between what the actual rationale was and what eventually was depicted in the theory of change. And also the new entity that was set up to help households get connected to the sewer network was stymied by infrastructure delays. So there were these important complementarities between the institutional components and the infrastructure components. And when the infrastructure fell behind, even the institutional component couldn't sort of realize its benefits. Then also to touch on an evaluation we did for MCC in Mozambique. Here, thinking especially about drainage. New solid waste management utilities had been set up, but again, this process is slow and they needed more support by the time the compact was over. And so they were struggling by the time we came to do the evaluation. And we saw some interesting evidence of the importance of sort of local culture and norms, comparing two cities, both of which received drainage infrastructure. In one city, thanks to sort of really compelling leadership by the mayor and a strong sense of community spirit in that city, there was really excellent maintenance of the drains, whereas in another city without those components, the drains had already become quite clogged and were not fulfilling their purpose. And also, it's worth noting that without a baseline data on flooding and the key outcomes that were expected to result from reductions in flooding, we weren't able to quantify the benefits of the investment. Last slide. So finally, just a couple takeaways for program design. First of all, institutional reforms, of course, take a long time to implement, and then the effects can materialize over an even longer period, which challenges traditional evaluation approaches. We can't even necessarily just wait longer to see for these to come into being, because in that ensuing time, other factors come into play, COVID-19, for example, other reforms, other donors' activities, and it becomes much harder to attribute any changes in outcomes to the program itself. Secondly, assumptions underlying the theory of change can be just as important as successful implementation of the activities. And we've seen this in a few of the evaluation results we've profiled. And finally, especially for programs that work with utilities, administrative and evaluation data can be synergistic. So we had a real success story in working closely with the utility in Cabo Verde and providing answers to questions that they wanted to know that we also weren't able, that we were then able to help them answer. Okay, over to you, Shrina.
Thanks. And Claire, there are a couple of questions about Cabo Verde in the chat, so you can look at those to answer when we get to the discussion section. I'm going to talk pretty quickly here. Just kind of, as I said, MCC conducted this retrospective on all of these evaluations, even more than what Mateusz and Claire have tried to pick out from in this short session. And we sort of synthesized and highlighted some overarching lessons that we plan to apply for WASH programming going forward, and frankly can probably apply to many other sectors as well. I'm not going to spend too much time. You can hopefully these nice graphics convey the point, but number one, very basic but important, know your problem and quantify it. So if you really are trying to want to target diarrhea in a country, make sure we understand exactly the baseline level of diarrhea and all of the mechanisms that are contributing to that, the prevalence of diarrhea. Second, I think we've hammered this over the audience's head probably many times already, but design for targeted results using the program logic, or we were using the term theory of change, but using that as a tool to make sure that we're designing our interventions to really incorporate the systems thinking, target the beneficiaries we're really trying to reach. And sorry, I just got a message here, and then make sure that we are actually targeting the results we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please. Next is just thinking more about kind of from a utility institutions perspective. The evaluations highlighted the importance of operations and maintenance and making sure that we're not just thinking about building the infrastructure and leaving, but also equipping our partner utilities to really use and maintain that infrastructure, which is often a very new kind of infrastructure that's a lot less mechanical and a lot more computer or managed than it was in the past. And so just making sure that we're leaving adequate time to train and equip utility staff to manage that. And then thinking about collaborating to build and strengthen data systems. And here we're talking largely about helping utilities set up and use robust data systems to understand the quality of their assets, or the status of their assets, and their service provision around their service area. And then also trying to think about doing that in a way that can also facilitate robust monitoring and evaluation, sort of a win-win scenario if we can make it happen. Next slide, please. As Claire spoke a lot about, cost recovery is paramount when promoting sustainable water and sanitation service for all. There's always a tension between increasing access, but without making a utility go into the red. And so that's something that we are continuing to think about. And then also the Cabo Verde example demonstrated the importance of factoring donor coordination into sustainability planning so that we can each kind of coordinate and build on one another's efforts rather than sort of coming in and out of a country and sort of starting over with every new donor investment. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into this too much because you can look at the document that's in the files, but we do have a page that kind of summarizes everything that MCC has ever done in WASH. And so that's the first link. For those of you who don't have the time to read 200 pages of econometrics, which are what our evaluation reports are often like, we also produce these 4-page summaries that cover the key findings and lessons from every evaluation that are really targeted to policymakers. So go to our evaluation briefs page. You can search by any sector and country and get the sort of so what of every evaluation that we've commissioned. And then this all of this reflection on our first 15 years of WASH programming resulted in a paper, the Principles into Practice paper. And you can also go into our evaluation catalog if you want those full long reports, if you want any of our survey instruments. And also we publish our data sets, public use files, and some are restricted access. So if you're a grad student and want to do some analysis of our microdata, please go to the catalog for that. Next slide. All right, opening it up for discussion. We were curious just if the results that we shared have either reinforced or challenged how your organization approaches its work, and also very interested to hear about efforts how MCC might leverage efforts that others are doing kind of in this urban infrastructure and reform space, and also in terms of emerging data collection technologies to strengthen data systems. So Claire, maybe you want to take the first couple of questions that were in the chat, or maybe you already, looks like maybe you already did in the chat, but if others have questions, I think you can raise your hand and or put it into the chat, and then we can unmute you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just fumbling to spotlight myself here again. How do I do that? No. Okay, sorry. I'm not sure how to spotlight myself, actually. I know how to spotlight other people, but yeah, I was able to answer James's question in the chat. And Dennis, I was just going to quickly answer yours. So James had asked about the influence of the importance of desalination on the findings of the evaluation Cabo Verde and in general the situation there, and whether that makes it hard to sort of extrapolate from that experience to other contexts. And certainly the utility faces unusual challenges there, and the cost of water is quite high in Cabo Verde, but customers are actually accustomed to that. And the project wasn't so ambitious as to try to find a way for the utility to offer water at a similar price as you might see in other countries. So I think that the approach of using infrastructure to incentivize reforms could certainly be effective in other places as well, even if the cost of producing water is not as high. And then to Dennis's question about whether there was a sort of wellspring of consumer demand for reforms versus just sort of a carrot and stick approach. I mean, Shrina, you can weigh in on this one as well, but I think it really was mainly a carrot and stick. So there were many, in leadership positions in the government and in the civil society also, who realized that these kind of changes really needed to happen. The municipal water departments were extremely inefficient. I don't think I mentioned one particular statistic, but the staffing to customer ratio fell by 3/4 after they created this multi-municipal corporatized utility relative to the municipal water departments. So I think that it was largely the carrot and stick approach of the that motivated the institutional reform, as opposed to sort of coming from the consumer base there. And I see there was a question from Lewis, but I haven't read that one yet.
I was just reading through that one, and it's more to MCC. And so the question is broadly about whether MCC, whether we should have anticipated or could have anticipated some of these issues that the evaluations have highlighted. And because they're not new issues per se, other actors in the space have experienced them before, and how we're thinking about programming potentially differently to incorporate these perspectives, and thinking about sustainability as well. And so, yes, it is true. I will caveat the caveat you already gave us, which is a lot of these programs are old and were implemented in the very early days of MCC, when we were this new organization that was really still figuring out how to operate. So yeah, I think that the teams were kind of pushing out programs too quickly and didn't consider all of these different aspects enough. We didn't use theories of change or program logic tools to the extent that we do now early on. And so I think the evaluations really, and having evaluations that really were structured around a theory of change really helped to highlight how important it is to consider all of these issues up front. We've now incorporated problem diagnostic more formally, root cause analysis, into our program development process, because we recognized that we weren't really capturing all of the issues that underpinned that we were trying to solve, or when we were designing projects. And I'll also say that, I mean, a challenge that we just continue to face is scope creep. I think from our perspective, we would want these projects to be very targeted and somewhat limited in some ways, but there's always influences, and these days, whether it's climate change or thinking about social inclusion issues, or even thinking about bringing the private sector into our project, I will just say that there's just a lot to be thinking about as we design these projects. And we do coordinate with other donors and are plugged into other, to sectoral sort of expertise as we design things, but there are often just practical realities that get in the way, which is why it's so great that MCC has this practice of evaluation, and we on the evaluation side just keep trying to hammer home these lessons so that we fully incorporate them and don't make similar mistakes again. I don't see any more questions in the chat. We have 2 minutes. Oh, another, yeah, Lewis, your hand is up.
We have to unmute Lewis. Okay, Lewis, I think, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now go ahead.
Good. No, thank you for the response. And I mean, the evaluations were great, and I appreciate the candor of your response. I'm thinking of another session I was in today, and USAID had a sustainable wash systems program that ran for 5 years. And there's a lot of learning from that program about more effective ways to engage in WASH systems, not just about the what in terms of the hardware and the finance, but the how in terms of the networks and how decisions are made and incentives and motivations of various players. So it would probably be helpful if the folks at MCC who are now designing WASH programs are fully familiar with that sort of information.
Thanks. Yep, I appreciate that, and yes, I will look into that particular program experience. And I think, yeah, it's these kinds of exchanges are really great to really understand from the back end, kind of how did these things actually go, not just what are you implementing, but did it actually work? So thank you for that. And we are at time. So I didn't see any other questions, and it looks like we've got to move on. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. I think that all of our materials are there in the files and can be accessed later, as well as the recording of this session. And thank you again to our sponsors, and thank you, Claire and Mateusz. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Shrina.
Thank you, Shrina.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys.